The following podcast is rated I for intellectual. It contains jargonistic terminology that may be too stimulating for some listeners. Topics discussed are approached with an emphasis towards educational fair use. Critical thinking is advised.
Hello, this is Dr. Garrett Castleberry, Associate Professor and Program Director of Communication, Media, and Ethics at Mid-America Christian University. I'm joined by my partner in crime as part of this dynamic duo for our Season 2 of Special Topics in Media, our lecture podcast series where we're looking at variations in media types, and everything from the content that is produced by media to the context in which it is released, as well as the audiences or consumers that partake in various mass media and the institutions that produce them. So once again, we're welcoming our audience in media res here to episode 4 of Special Topics, where we are looking at the medium of comics. And with the comic book medium in an accelerated course track, we actually have narrowed down our focus to a single graphic novel as our subject text under examination. And that text is Frank Miller's Batman: The Dark Knight Returns from 1986, of course, with work by Klaus Janson and Lynn Varley. We can't forget about those additional artists, inkers, pencilers, and everyone that works together in what is a very collaborative medium, comic books. But of course, as we're familiar now in the 21st century, comics aren't just an inclusive collaborative medium. They are spreadable across the mass media spectrum. And we're talking about the influence of The Dark Knight Returns, which will be, to look ahead, a tease. The future 5th episode will be examining its influence across the Batman canon and looking at ways that it has been a kind of new foundational text in this mythos. But in order to get to that place, we want to wrap up the narrative. So in episode 4, we're looking at book 4 of The Dark Knight Returns. And Scott, would you say book 4 provides us a number of healthy closures to the narrative?
Yes, we've kind of set up a lot of the storylines. There's the new Robin, the aging Batman, the geopolitical situation, the idea of the vigilante versus the official, either government or local law enforcement representative. The whole issue of being able to trust the government, trust those established sources that are legal, and the inherent criticism of the current presidential administration. As we have discussed in the past, these are all very current topical themes for the mid-'80s when this comic is being created, and therefore in some ways more meaningful to that audience in some ways, in ways that would have immediately resonated with the ongoing tensions in the world between a renewed conservative proposition, both in mental health and in government and in law enforcement, and sort of this weighing of the balances, and most importantly, as we see in chapter 4, in how it's going to play out between the Soviet Union and the United States, the only superpowers, between them carving up the whole world, and people starting to wonder, is there any good guy here? Because if we all end up roasted at the end of a nuclear, marshmallow stick, then there's no winners. It's hard to recapture the zeitgeist. It's hard to recapture the anxiety that the common person felt in 1985 and 1986 and 1984 as all this is going down. Nobody knows yet if there will be a nuclear war, but people are seriously worried about it because the Soviet Union is flailing. So here we are back in 1986, and we're going to have an imaginary resolution to some of this that, thank God, is not what happens in the real world. That's why we have comics.
Isn't it true, though, that popular culture often provides us those imaginary solutions, or perhaps envisions even worse situations, so that we can feel better about the status quo?
It affects real decisions. I mean, these are these kind of popular mass media literature are extraordinarily important to the way things work out in real life, because literature has always served this function. It lets us imagine other outcomes so that we don't have to experience them. And so if if you read this, if you read The Watchmen in 1985, you could very well be influenced, even if you're a person of, that has a lot of influence in real life. You could very well start to understand that, maybe we are locked into a certain mentality and we don't want to proceed that. We don't pursue that to its ultimate uh, implications. We want to be more sane here. Lots of calls for reason in 1986 for people to just be sane. I think we get a little bit of this at the end of the Dark Knight.
And once again, I'm reminded of the heavy presence of mass media as a kind of meta message within this text. We get all of these cut-ins to local news media. And we've talked about in every episode this through line of the dawn of cable news, and that really mass media plays an intimate role in American history and in American mythology. Mass media figures help build up, mythologize political figures, military figures, as often as they perhaps tear them down, right? As do historians, and historians, the most well-known, writing, contributing to our literature, our historical working knowledge about our society. And so, what we get through an artistic reimagining of this is a kind of a fantasy scenario where someone with a voice and someone with a story to tell is able to use the tools at their disposal. That is, their observations, their close observations of the way things are, and play with those, right? The performance and anthropological scholar Richard Schechner writes about play theory, right? And the sort of quality needs that it meets, not just for children, right? This idea of play. And aren't we talking about a medium that is often kind of given the blind eye and looked at as children's fare? But this idea that we all play or inhabit roles that are what Urban Goffman refers to as performances of everyday life, even. But what we've definitely seen in the latter decades of the 20th century and the early decades of the 21st century is a society that is invested in these ideas of advanced play, whether it is gaming, video games and gaming systems, and we even have an esports team or teams springing up, right, like Wells in and around our region. But we see other types of play in the forms of costume play or cosplay, right? People are buying into these fads and these icons, right? That represent significant commerce in really devoted types of ways. And works like this help stimulate not only that economy, but that cultural side of creative expression, and maybe even a sense of community, right? So in book 4, we emerge outside the other side of the tunnel of love. So if you recall, we had a book 3's climax gave us a fatal duel between Batman and his arch nemesis, the Joker, who had orchestrated his own escape from Arkham Asylum, and subsequent just a sort of terroristic run across Gotham City, right? He was darker and more depraved than ever, which is a critique against the claims that they were being rehabilitated by these, celebrity doctors and pseudo psychologists. And so Batman, to paraphrase his words, he had no choice, right? The time had come. He was going to take it as far as he had ever done before. And so we get this bending, almost breaking. So it's pun intended, of his own rule, right? He breaks the Joker's neck without killing him. But the Joker, with the kind of, almost, as he says, devilish strength, is able to finish the job for him, thus framing Batman, right? So he's pulling the ultimate joke.
Physical nadir, if you will. I mean, we open chapter 4 with Batman literally on the operating table, because in the process of eliminating this ultimate evil threat, he's nearly sacrificed his own life, and continues all during that with self-commentary about how reduced he feels in his own capacities, but he's nearly dead. We think he might be dead by the time that he's on the operating table. So he's this has all come at a tremendous personal sacrifice to him, which helps us to trust his motivations. It's not just something he's saying he's willing to die for justice, right? I mean, Batman, I don't know if we ever talked about this on the air, but when we were writing up notes to begin with, I said, Batman's one-word synopsis is justice, even to the point that, you can make a joke out of it. Forgive me for repeated this, but, my son told me a joke a couple of years ago. He said, "Why did Batman cross the road?" And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Justice," right? And I get it because that's, he is the ultimate moral authority in a world that, in some ways, in reality, but certainly in this imagined world, that has no moral compass. You have to be worried about authorities that are either trying to appease or get rich or get ahead in some ways. And so Batman seems often to be the only individual capable of just moral consideration. And so we grow to trust him through these examples, and to distrust some of the other people that are against him, including the police force.
Well, it's interesting you use the word individual, right? Batman, it is core ideology. He's a heightened sense of individuality, and that is innately American in certain ways. It's a very Western philosophy of life. In communication, we talk about the difference when we're examining various cultural groups, as we recognize the difference between warm culture versus cold culture climates, and how in warmer geographical areas of the world, you have more collectivist activities in people groups and communities, whereas the further you get from those types of areas, typically in northern regions, these cold culture climates tend to give us more individualistic, right, or isolated people groups. And in Bruce Wayne, in Batman, we have that sort of individualist ideology, and he is a lone, not a lone gunman, but a loner by trade. And I think part of the checks and balances that he sees in himself, the need to retain a sidekick as well as a confidant, a butler, and Alfred, is that it is keeping him from going all the way over the edge, which is a tightrope walk that I believe this book stresses he's walking daily. On the other hand, we have a different figure that does also include justice in his modus operandi. It's truth, justice, and the American way, whatever that is, and that would be Superman, aka Clark Kent. we were teased Clark's presence in a voicemail in book one, and then sort of hinted at a chest, a crest of recognizable value in book two, before in book three having a full page spread out in the sunny skies and butterflies and open fields. Clark attempting to kind of temper down and put Bruce's intents at bay, because it's implied that that perhaps this retirement over a decade ago wasn't entirely his decision, that it was part of a collaborative effort, whether they wished that or not. And I definitely think that aspect of the story comes front and center in book four, and what it leads to ultimately.
We're also made to know that the Superman is an instrument of the government. He's on the leash of the government. For all his nobility and high-mindedness, he basically functions as a nuclear deterrent and as a watchdog. And his job has been, you need to go get Batman back on the leash, because he's gotten off again and it's causing all kinds of problems. So there's that. The tension comes. Lots of ways that tension is always there between Batman and Superman. We mentioned from the very beginning, one of them is essentially immortal. The other one's just a guy with a lot of tech and enough, enough obsessive willpower to actually do what he does. And, but this other tension here is to the extent that we know Batman by his actions is trying to do what's right and necessary to maintain order, we start to question whether Superman is doing what's really right here, or if he's just doing what he's told. And that immortal versus man. In the very first, I believe in chapter 4, the very first couple of frames that we see them together, you get a striking comparison of a very athletic and young-looking Superman, and Batman looks like, a skeleton. I don't know. You look tired, Kent. He says, to the extent that I'm not even sure. To the extent that I'm not even sure if is that Batman or Alfred. I think it's supposed to be Batman saying, "You look tired, Kent." But in any case, he's even if that's not Batman, he's very much contrasted in his age and his physical disability, if you want to call it that, as opposed to Batman's eternal youth.
I almost wondered if that was Perry, his newspaper boss.
Maybe so. Yeah.
In that very limited frame, we don't get a lot of information there, but
just noticing he has glasses, so I don't think it's Bruce.
To kind of build off of that, we have this stark opposition that's emerging between these two, indomitable forces. Batman and Superman, the quote-unquote world's finest, and that's what we're getting in book 4. If the Joker was Bruce's Gotham-based foe, what unfolds in book 4 is a larger than life showdown between two titans in essence. And I think it's important to recognize how we got to this point. Like, wait a minute, what are we talking about? Aren't these allies and friends? Aren't they members of the Justice League? And really, that's what this book has been teasing all along, that there was a fallout, right? Not unlike a nuclear fallout, which is a theme that this book plays with as well. But there was a fallout between these great heroes, these superheroes of the past. And perhaps it's a shout out to its own previous history. That is to say, the history of superhero comics. A fallout to say that the golden age or silver age of superheroes and superheroism no longer works in this world, that the world is what has changed. And maybe it changes these characters in ways that make us uncomfortable or make us pause and reflect on it. I think chapter 4, book 4, whatever we're calling it, issue 4, deals directly with the theme of power and what it means to have power, and what it means to wield power, and we get it in variations, right? It's a layered approach. It's heavy-handed. It's not unlike the super punches that are dealt toward book's end, but we're getting this reflection on power, and these are two uniquely Americanized type characters, right? These are tried and true. These are creations of an American medium, really, mass medium, and then that is comic books, and Superman represents that the bright side of things, the optimism, right? The sort of that entrepreneurial spirit of America. It's this sort of mythologized belief in ourselves, right? And Batman, at the same token, is kind of that darker, cynical side of it. It's also innovative, right? He's also a sort of demonstration of entrepreneurial imagination. But
this is what really captures my imagination about the DC universe is from the very beginning, two of the earliest superheroes, you have this almost perfect yin and yang of the superhero world, hero, anti-hero, and in their origins and in what they do. I went back before these podcasts and went back and read some very old Superman comics. And from the very beginning, I mean, it is painfully moralistic, right? I mean, it's always, even as a little Superboy, he does the right thing by the girl at the birthday party whose the other children won't come to her birthday party because her father's been falsely accused of a crime. And so he not only fixes it up, but, makes sure all the other kids come to the birthday party and, is the good friend who does the right thing. This is just not the world of Batman, right? Batman is someone who, out of desperation and personal need, is trying to address the gross injustices of crime and punish evildoers. And so it's no wonder that these two have sort of remained at the front of the canon for DC, but also that it seems endless the opportunities to compare and contrast them because they do fit so nicely together, two sides of a coin, in terms of what it would mean to have, what is justice and doing the right thing all about. And it's a little bit about both, right?
Well, and isn't it interesting that once again these two characters embody the U.S. in different ways? One is very much about adhering to the status quo, sort of respecting the innate authority of a government and certainly military as an extension of that. We have Superman, as you just described. He's living out that Boy Scout mentality, right? It was always used as a kind of, takedown for him. And certainly by the 1980s, Boy Scouts of America was no longer that, eminently popular social affair for young lads. Instead, we've got we've got VHS blockbusters popping up, right? We have arcades, and among the most popular heroes are Dirty Harry, right? You have Death Wish, and you have this emergence of anti-heroes replacing heroes. That was already a theme that played itself out in the history of the American Western, the film Western, where you have these stages of the squeaky clean golden hero that is able to renounce all forms of evil or temptation and cleanse the town, to the anti-hero figure who always lives outside of its boundaries and borders and can only save it or sanctify the situation because he is marked and sort of a product of a fallen world, like Bruce. And the reason we're brought to such climax between these characters from these opening pages, Bruce is no longer holding back. All right, so to remind our readers, he's using explosives and weapons to escape the Tunnel of Love, to escape an onslaught of Gotham police and SWAT units. He talks about the SWAT unit being covered in rubble, right, to help mask his escape. The chopper that rescues him and Robin is, it's firing weapons, and what does he do? He retreats to the surgeon's table yet again, as we're now familiar, right? This is stock and trade for him. But as soon as
just to be clear, he has another weapon besides his explosive. He now has Robin, who's now a weapon. So it's actually Robin who engineers the escape. Robin's now fully in control somehow after her 8-day training period. She's fully in control of all the tech, and so is really contributing here, and in fact sort of saves the old Batman again, and lassos him out of this fight with the police, and gets him hustled back to the Batcave.
Well,
Which,
and let's remember,
portrayed as a very sympathetic heroine, a hero now in her own right, and fully matured in terms of her function as part of the team.
when Carrie's loyal, right? She, as he calls her in the book, a good soldier, right? But she, I think at one point in book 3, he tells her that these contraptions, these vehicles, are voice activated, which this is not. I mean, to say it predates, Siri and Alexis is an understatement. This is in the age of fantasy tech and James Bond and that sort of thing, and so that would be cutting edge technology, which the Batman figure Bruce Wayne is known for, right? He's an investor. He's like Tony Stark. But let's rewind the tape and remember how lo-fi technology was in the 1980s. So we're getting that sense of like future forward thinking in terms of tech, practical tech that can get you out of a situation, which substitutes Batman's lack of a superpower, right? He's mortal, he's human, and so he must rely on magic in the form of technology, right? Which is something that some of the comic scholars and mythology scholars have talked about over the years. This idea that technology serves as a modern form of magic, right? An aid to help the hero through his or her quest. So we mentioned that in addition to Batman, in addition to Robin, we have these factions of our original foes, the mutants, and they've taken on these various guises. And one of them is Sons of Batman, right? And what we are treated to, and I say that tongue in cheek, is we see the Sons of Batman out there performing actual vigilante violence on the streets, and it's ugly. It is not kind. It's fatal. We also see a different remaining faction of the group behind bars, but not for long. And their breakout is ugly. And what I was reminded was throughout this book, Miller plays with dark themes, and we've talked about his influences of living around a very crime-ridden New York City, and how the culture was so different in the 1970s up into the 80s there, and he doesn't let up. I keep waiting for this release, right? Whether it's Batman's Return or what have you, to kind of cut back, and instead he's accelerating the dark turn. And it serves as a through line, because what it does is forces us to wrestle with whether or not we need a kind of outside the law figure to solve these problems.
I would say even further, he's not just continuing, he's elaborating the violence. Having introduced us to this whole dilemma now for many pages about what you do about violence, he's subtilizing these groups, right? The mutants And so there's visual cues, right? The mutants that retain their little visors, these are reprobates. They kill a cop breaking out of prison. They are only interested in violence and gratification. The Sons of Batman are starting to emerge as a more disciplined force that that says somewhere one of these Sons of Batman says, "Criminals beware," right? Which is an old Batman line, right? Criminals beware. It's so at least in their own minds and in their rationale, they are on the side of justice in a way that the remaining mutants are not. So he's splintered them up into these groups, I think, in order to, and I think we'll see later, it's kind of a foreshadowing that some of these Sons of Batman will actually become, in a way, Sons of Batman, in that they will adopt his ethic and not violence for violence sake, but violence to protect the innocent. And these through lines are reinforced by, as he does in the rest of the book, as Miller does, with individual stories. And so you have individual people being, you have a woman being interviewed on the TV, with with her identity protected by the black bar, which is an echo of the mutant scream. But she has been accosted by one of these mutants, who wanted to take advantage of her and be extremely violent, and was saved by some of these Sons of the Batman. And so she's the message that keeps popping up from beginning to end is, let's hear what victims of violence have to say. Somebody who's saved from rape, someone who's saved from murder, someone who's saved from robbery, by a vigilante might have a much more favorable impression of that vigilante than you know than others. And so I think it's fascinating how he uses individual storylines like this to reinforce that subtilization of violence. Yeah, there's some people that are just bad, violent, and there's some people though that are courageous enough to use violence to fight fire with fire.
We even revisit an unnamed person that was interviewed by news media. So of course, like the angry survivor in book 3, I believe, but he resurfaces here. He's interviewed again, this time with a neck brace. He's been in yet another count. This was the individual that pushed someone into the subway in front of the movie, oncoming train, only to be stopped by an invisible Superman. I say invisible; he just moves too fast for us to see him. This individual pops back up. He's nastier than ever, and we know this person. I don't, everyone reads it in their own way, and they're interpreting in their own way. But literature has a certain open-endedness to it, as much as it also has a closed-ended kind of fixed intent or author's intent. But there's certainly always the way that we bring something to the table anytime we're readers, right? Umberto Eco writes about the role of the reader, and this is what he's talking about. But this character, when you read the way he describes things, his cynical view about reality, I'm talking about the unnamed man in the glasses with the neck brace who's interviewed, and he has committed crimes in what we'll discuss shortly, which is an event that takes place that puts Gotham into turmoil, into a kind of temporary eternal night, right, or darkness. And his reaction to those circumstances show a lot about his character. Just as you say, other people's responses help us identify the plurality of perspectives. But let's talk about what gets us there. Amidst Batman's escape and need for a kind of rebirth yet again, Superman's been out here representing America on the larger stage. He's already thwarted a sort of invasion of Corto Maltese, right? Which we debated before we came online of where and what that area represents. Is it akin to the Cuban Missile Crisis? Is it akin to the, or is it like the Bay of Pigs? Is it, what?
The Falkland Islands is the other thing that was very proximal to this. Anyway, go ahead.
And once again, if he was flying through Soviet fighter jets in the last issue, this time he's having to use all of his strength / self-control to slow down and alter the course of like a megaton explosive. And ultimately what we get is a kind of offshore nuclear detonation that's also triggers a kind of EMP, right? Is this
Right.
kind of a electromagnetic pulse that creates a blackout throughout the entire region.
And let me speculate here about what Miller is thinking about. Again, someone who has lived long enough to remember some of this firsthand, and kind of concurrent here with the last years of the Soviet Union, heightened sense of military crisis, uh, uh, nuclear buildup toward what they call mutually self-assured destruction, or mutually assured destruction. MAD, right? Was the idea that the only way you win a nuclear conflict is to strike first and kill them all before they can launch theirs. And so there was a lot of concern about this in the middle of this, right about this time, a little earlier, in the early 80s. A huge concern developed about what was called a neutron bomb. And I think that even though he ultimately calls it an EMP bomb, I think what people are meant to think of is the idea of the neutron bomb. And the neutron bomb would release deadly radiation and kill people, but had minimum explosive force. The idea being that the way you win this war is you kill all their people, and then their stuff is still good. You can, or if they manage to hit you, you can still operate your factories. And he has a little throwaway line in here that's what they intended is that they wanted to use this bomb so that they could still continue to use the. In other words, the suspicion was at the highest circles, they want to wipe out the population, but preserve intact their ability to continue making war. And that's, we actually made neutron bombs in 81 or 82 during the Reagan administration, first term. But the protest at this was so intense that we stopped making those shortly thereafter, and eventually dismantled all of them as part of the bigger strategic arms limitation treaty that came in the aftermath, the end of the Soviet Union, and led to the disarmament, going backwards on the nuclear clock. So I think that he's conflating the old Bay of Pigs incident, which was in '62, where we came about that close to actually having nukes launched at us off of Cuba, and that was all part. That's early Cold War. That's part of the communist democracy problem. And then I think you may be conflating that though with in '82 again was the Falkland Islands invasion by the Argentine military junta, which was one of these ultra-right organizations that was originally supported by the Reagan administration because we were trying to defend against communism, taking over in that part of the world with their proximity to Cuba and all this. And so, of course, we disavowed that once we understood that they were running death squads and all kinds of things. But I think that Miller's conflating both of these ideas in the public imagination when he makes up this incident with Corto Maltese, an island off the coast of South America. Well, that could apply to either Cuba or the Falkland Islands. So.
Yeah, very good. And your description of the neutron bomb got me thinking about, this was not the only text of its time that has an essence or air of kind of punk culture and rampant crime, and that captured the popular imaginary. And so I'm talking about now texts that were right in hand with the era in which this story was written. I'm reminded of John Carpenter's Escape from New York, and here is a text that's, a kind of future shock that's supposing a New York City has just lost itself entirely to the point that we're walling it off. It's a pure prison state. But
what year was that? What year was that? Because that's very close in time.
1981, 82, 81, I think.
And we have to be saved by Snake Plissken, who is a career criminal. That's, he's an anti-hero. So,
yeah, absolutely an anti-hero. And that's a narrative that blends the urban crime drama with this futuristic sci-fi with the Western. And so you're seeing a lot of genre hybridity very creatively executed with these types of tasks. When you talked about the neutron bomb, I also thought of the movie Repo Man, viewed a little bit less. Was that a neutron bomb that they were sort of?
Maybe. It's the ultimate MacGuffin, right?
It was a MacGuffin.
It's the thing that everybody must see that you can't see. It travels around most of the movie in the trunk of a car.
It's certainly a movie that deals with those tensions, though, and how you had segments of the populace clamoring for a different way to seek out identity, right? That you had tensions between conformist and nonconformist worldviews and what they wanted that to look like. Anarchists, nihilists versus, those that were willing to kind of go along and kind of trust in the status quo. Well, the streets of Gotham, as a result of this explosion, turn into the ultimate chaos. And this is because the city experiences a blackout as a result of this nuclear megaton explosion, right? This EMP-esque event. And
because it's not clear, we should say, and planes are falling out of the sky. That's what's happening here. It's a little bit in the whole segment with Commissioner Gordon worrying about Sarah and why is the apartment building on fire. It's a plane has fallen out of the sky because the EMP pulse has knocked out its electronics.
And this is also, it's caused, what do you call it, when the lights are out in the prison, the mutants have an opportunity to break free. And, with all the electronics down, this would seemingly put our hero up against it because he's a man of technology. He's a man of resources. And of course, he tells Robin, to the stables. And lo and behold, we have Batman riding in on a horse to save Gotham. But
he's a hero without the tech. Even without the tech, he's a hero. It's a great point, good observation, and very intentional. Just before that happens, I think there's a very important set of panels. Maybe Will can stick it up there, but where Batman, who's again just been aroused from the operation, right, but now apparently able to go. He says, since Wayne Manor's emergency generator hasn't kicked in and Robin's watch has stopped, I'll assume Russian has taken the lead in the arms race. I keep track of these things, Clark. One of us has to. And so here he's absolutely taking the moral high ground about even the thing you were trying to prevent, which is the nuclear arms race, you caused it. And so one of us has to fix it, Superman, and it'll be me.
This is in that throwaway moment, I'm glad you brought it up. It's a nice critique, right? A meta critique of the very reactive nature of superheroes, that superheroes are in a kind of defensive stance where they're always stopping the crime after it's been committed, the bank job after the robbery has taken place. And Batman is suggesting to Clark that you need a more proactive stance on crime fighting, that you can't wait for it to get that far. And that's very much a political talking point, right? I mean, if it, we would expect to hear Batman saying that on his, YouTube channel or podcast, right, in the 21st century, making for all of his Bat followers, right, to be able to kind of get on top of. But he has a plan, because Batman always has a plan, and so they ride in like a posse, and most notably, you think about maybe the hero coming in on a white horse. It's a proverbial symbology of good. Batman, in fact, meets the streets on a black stallion, because everything's gotta be dark for him.
That's what an anti-hero horse looks like.
Yeah. And he, at this point, though, he intervenes and kind of has a moment of true a true action by words, right, by his rhetoric, and he essentially becomes a general at this stage, and calls the mutant faction to task. He gives them the ultimate invitation to join him and follow him, or else, right?
Well, and I think it's where we start to see this collectivism that's going to be forward as the solution, right? That there are some among the mutants who want truth and justice. There's some among the Sons of Batman that want truth and justice, and so he becomes, even as Commissioner Gordon, in his agony over the potential of having lost his wife, descends into this sort of pure vigilante behavior. Batman is summoning a coalition of the willing. Couldn't say that better.
Yes.
to stand up on the side of the right and do the right thing and fight against violence. Maybe the ultimate lesson is there's no easy way out of this. Some people have to be willing to stand up against violence.
Absolutely. Miller's giving us a kind of he's setting up these conditions of, power doesn't assure you anything really, and what we are able to do then is just see two opposing forces and what those circumstances might look like. It just as so many writers have played out the scenario of what the tables look like if they're reversed in a Cold War situation. The movie Red Dawn from the mid 80s comes to mind, right? A sort of imaginative look at what happens if Russia invades the U.S., the Soviets rather, and win the Cold War outright by military force. Miller's playing with this within the realm of superheroes and what that looks like. And so what allows Batman the opportunity, at least a puncher's chance of coming out ahead, is that this nuclear blast has temporarily decimated Superman, right? It's sort of suggesting visually through some very morbid drawings and illustrations, by the way, that Superman is essentially depowered through this strike, and as a result, he is cast out, shrouded in lightning bolts and things, and then by the next page, very gothic, his sort of almost bizarro Superman looking depiction. It's grotesque, right? It's really alien. But what does Superman do? As he falls to Earth, Gotham and the area is now experiencing not only a blackout, but that kind of like nuclear winter, and the ashes are kind of, we're led to believe, keeping that sunlight from powering him. And let's remember, Superman's ultimate powers come from our yellow sun, whereas on his home world of Krypton, they have a red sun that had him sort of would behave in a kind of contemporary way with other citizens of that area of the galaxy. But Superman also shows us his regenerative power. He's literally absorbing Mother Earth and thanking her for it. So we know he's on the mend. But this is where we get that interlude, and it's an interlude between action set pieces, really. And it's those tales that I recounted earlier, where people are debating this. They're on the news. They're outraged, right? And so here we have a sample of outrage culture. What a harbinger, right, for where we're at in the 21st century, and everyone looking to have their voice known and make it as pithy as possible, right? So we have our pinheads and our patriots there, and but Batman is handling the mean streets, and he's corralling the the evildoers, no less, right? Not unlike a cowboy, and this sets up a kind of showdown, right? At the Gotham Corral, crime alley, in fact, where President Reagan has basically told Superman to essentially take the gloves off and put this PR situation that is Batman to rest. Is that an accurate setup?
Yes, I think so. It's again his given ultimately that Reagan was a pretty successful president and did successfully navigate both an improved economy and ultimately the fall of the Soviet Union without a nuclear disaster. It's in retrospect, you can see the contempt that Reagan collected from many people who were maybe guilty of exactly what he's portraying here. A little bit of panic over how this would all end. I mean, if you think that there's a serious threat that the Russians might launch nuclear weapons, it tends to heighten the rhetoric a little bit. And so when we do see Reagan again, he's got his own horse. It's a scooter, and he's apparently in some sort of night clothes that are red and white striped, you know, and so he looks like a corpse already, and he's been portrayed as a doddering idiot before. So Miller here is showing his personal contempt for what he perceives as a conservative presidency that's going to get us in a nuclear war. But I thought that was a nice contrast of the vigorous Batman and the doddering leader of the country on a motorized scooter.
Well, I'm reminded of a critique that we see often, and you know what? If you occupy such a place of privilege and power, you're open to critique, and I think a hallmark of an open democracy is that activation of freedom of speech, whether it is in poor taste or not, is up to critics, right, to help parcel. But a different panel.
I'm not really after the right or the wrong here, just the trying to recapture the way people felt. It's hard to, Donald Trump's a polarizing president that receives a lot of critique and a lot of parody, but people don't often treat him as rough as Miller treats Reagan in this comic book. So it's, and again, I think that it'd be interesting to see how Miller feels about the day. Miller's still alive, isn't he?
Yes.
I know just a few years ago he was.
I was pulled up a clip. I was watching an interview with him from about 4 and 5 years ago, earlier today, and he was physically reminding me of this withered Superman in some way. It was an interesting juxtaposition. He was kind of
especially because he was wearing the suit.
But he looked closer to Reagan here in that interview, which is interesting. But I'm reminded of just a comical throwaway, but in the previous setting where the American public's kind of getting a final message from Reagan, it's like, whoops, we may have a nuclear war on our hands. He's in a hazmat suit, like a radiation suit. So this is a recurring trope in pop culture that I do think is worthy of pointing out, is this idea of the president is a powerful leader that occupies, central role, and then anytime we get them depicted as behind, like scurrying off to the secret bunker layer, it juxtaposes, it puts into question that whole idea of like the commander that's going down with the ship, right? Which it's totally practical, right? And who wouldn't prefer to take advantage of, said hidden nuclear fallout shelter? But it's the way that we play with that in on art, that it just highlights, right? It's sometimes the ridiculousness of it all.
I got one other point about this, about the battle in the streets of Gotham, and then I have a question. I want you to fill me in because you're the expert, and I know you should never ask an expert a question. So again, a personal story that typifies here a way forward is this. There's a little set piece about the priest who is really, it's a paired set. Narrative. Miller is very narratively sophisticated for somebody who's doing at least for this time in terms of a graphic novel. But he's got, if you notice, these paired stories, and they're both about mistaken identity. There's the venal, corrupt guy with the neck brace that we all hate. He's only out for himself. When things start to go bad, he starts shooting. And there's a woman who's just scared, who doesn't know what's going on and tries to go for him to help, and he strikes her. And he would have killed her, if he wasn't prevented from doing so. In the same time, you have this priest figure who at first is highly suspicious of the young punk mutant guy with the radio and assumes he's part of the crime, but ends up being saved by that individual and understanding that, that even though that mutant is a lot different from me, that mutant stands for something right instead of just for himself, and acknowledges that he owes his life to that person who he at first thought was just a punk. So I just think that that's brilliant narrative exposition. I don't care if it's, if it's The Dark Knight Returns or, or War and Peace. That's just good narrative exposition. Gives us a little match set that we can compare so that we get these tracks in our head. And I think it's intentional because we go there about how do we get out of this? Well, it comes down to individuals deciding to judge other individuals by their actions, what they do, and not by, what their status is or what they say or what kind of car they drive. Now,
yeah,
the Green Arrow. What's the backstory? You're the expert. You have hinted that there's been a big falling out. Is this something? It's my understanding that that's a real thing, right? In the DC universe, we've had this big crisis. Can you give some backstory on that?
Here's where I would go with this interpretation. And absolutely, we're right on the cusp of our latest cameo, right? A pop-in in book 4, and it's none other than Oliver. I
can't remember his last name. It's Oliver.
Amazing. He's been in pop culture floating around. I want to say Oliver Green, but that's not it. But we have the Green Arrow, who emerges, and he's very much of it's like a cross between a wily old sailor, right? He's balding with like long white locks of hair, and he's smoking from a pipe and that sort of thing. But he's also this is hippie spirit Green Arrow, and here's where I see this coming from. I've talked about the kind of open to interpretation meta history that this is playing with, and this idea that if Superman represents maybe a silver age or a golden age kind of idealized time in America and in superhero comics, and Batman maybe is reflective of an amalgamation, right? He's gone through many variations, but has ultimately emerged quite cynical and cantankerous and so on. This version of Oliver Queen is it reminds me of the Dennis O'Neill or Denny O'Neill and Neil Adams uh, camaraderie road trip comic series, Green Lantern, Green Arrow, in which you had these two friends, these superhero friends, kind of traveling about the country and encountering various social injustices. And so we're not just talking about supervillains, we're talking about racism, we're talking about sexism or issues regarding class status in the United States. And so it's very much of a kind of an Easy Rider-esque arc that took place with these characters. And Green Lantern was very much kind of the buttoned up, nothing's wrong with society, we're all living great, kind of occupying a white place of privilege, that role that, as we talk about today. Whereas Green Arrow was always pointing out these injustices, these wrongs, and so he was embodying a kind of Americanized, broader version of Robin of Locksley, right? The Robin Hood of famed lore, of which he borrows his green color scheme, and even the hat with the feather and the the motif of bows and arrows and all this, and it was brought down to a kind of type of realism, as realism as superhero comics can get. They're traveling through a pseudo reality that was less fanciful. It was boiled down. And so
it was concerned with social justice.
Yes.
In a way that not all superheroes have been. So
yeah, and what I see here, what I see Miller doing is creating his own stew of cherry picking which eras of heroes with which to play with and to bring into court here, and so we get an Oliver Queen.
It is Oliver Queen. I just Googled it while you were talking. Could you tell that I was just staring right through you and Googling?
I assumed, like all my students, you were listening intently and weren't on your phone doing
it's
other.
Never that. It's never that. There's always a phone or something.
But I sense that he's representing this most recent age of superhero comics, this, the 1970s era, which sometimes referred to as the Bronze Era. During that time, Batman would have been the world's greatest detective. As I mentioned in a previous episode, a lot of that sort of adventuring and traveling the world to solve crimes and this sort of thing. And so we're getting these variations, and that's part of the fun, right? That's what writers enter the medium for and dream about, is getting to pick and choose which versions of characters, which psychological makeups, which previous histories and historicities of continuities they want to bring into the fold of their own narrative storytelling. And I see Miller doing that. But what we do get, what kind of morsel he does drop for us, is of all the kind of ironic juxtapositions, this Oliver Queen is missing an arm, and of which his power is, just the most remarkable aim in the world. And it's insinuated that at the fallout of these superheroes, that Superman in fact took his arm, or allowed it to be, perhaps crushed or taken.
So if you're steeped in classical literature, you might have an allusion to Cat Mayhab, who's dismasted by the whale, and becomes fixated on the whale, that took his limb, and he certainly does look like a sailor here.
Well, absolutely. Didn't I say, doesn't he look like the nautical type, right? Yeah. Again, with his kind of New England-esque long white locks and cork pipe, right? I love this idea, and I think it's another, a nice literary shout out. Again, and they don't have to tell us. We can infer these things, and certainly this idea of the arrow as a harpoon of sorts, right? And he seeks a kind of revenge. He's willing to go the distance to get one back at Superman as he joins in this conquest ultimately, or this quest, right? This final quest, this fatal quest with Bruce. So The gauntlet's been thrown down. That same page we just showed, Superman uses his laser vision to zap down a warning message. Where, right? Just tell me where to meet. He understands it's time for a final showdown. Like, this has to end. There, it can't continue like comics ad infinitum. There needs to be a resolution. And Soup's at the behest of Reagan, Batman at the, representing Gotham in this corner. So of course Bruce calls him out to Crime Alley, the place of his origin, right? The death of his parents. And what a circle he's suggesting for closure here, that he's going to meet his parents, the ultimate death in the place of their demise. And so he tells Superman to meet him there. Of course, that's also his home turf, right? He's getting home field advantage. And so what we have is an ultimate showdown as our climax for the book. And I don't know if this totally caught readers off guard. I suspect it did, right? I suspect folks thought they were, getting into Batman and his rogues gallery and maybe just a sort of reestablishing of his status quo. And what we ultimately had was infighting, superhero infighting. And isn't that what we're all about in the US? I mean, talk about the cycles we get into, the ideological divide in this country, and how it can take away from our most prominent moments and achievements. And here we have, these ideological oppositions converging, the yin and the yang, as you've put it, and they yang it out, right? Like, there's a short battle just before midnight, right? A high noon reference, yet another Western reference. Before the clock strikes 12, they meet on the streets, and it's a fun tussle. And it's very interesting because, the reader really has to suspend some disbelief to kind of go along with this. And I think that's part of the challenge. I love that because it's part of the writer's challenge. It's the writer's challenge to make us be able to buy in. And I would say if this weren't effective, then we wouldn't see any influences from this encounter. But in fact, as we'll talk about in our 5th episode soon, this encounter has a little bit of a legacy growing in terms of its use, future uses. But Batman gets a couple of crucial punches in before he takes one, takes a belly, right?
Yeah. So they are. I love the way, some of the best frames here. They're, in this one, which you can display better than I can, but this is so aggravating. But they're displayed as equals, right? In this, you give some and you get some. Of course, this wouldn't be the case if Superman is who he is, but it's ideologically what has to happen. It's two indomitable wills, both. It's all the way back to Gilgamesh and the guy he fought, Enkidu. But it's also, you mentioned in Westerns, it's Giant. Isn't it Giant where they have the forever punch out that just keeps going? And I think there's a John Wayne movie where they have the idea being that you're matched against another ultimate force and you just punch each other until you're both stupid punch drunk, and then you become friends. And you think this is maybe where this is going, that they're going to acknowledge that they're both at this level. But of course there's ideological differences that are not going to allow Batman certainly to reconcile, because Superman is, in his conception of things, Superman has violated the trust. Superman is guilty in the same way that general that sold armaments to the mutants is. He's betrayed his trust and put everyone in peril.
It's what we're shown in this brief encounter, though, is Superman's ultimate restraint. I think a lot of people always get frustrated about, well, isn't he overpowered? And I think one of the great explainers that I ever heard was Superman's greatest power is actually the amount of self-control he has to use for everything, because he's so godlike, right? That and so that type of Zen restraint is yet another admirable quality, right?
Well,
Something for
and
to be
it
jealous
fits
about.
well with Superman's absolutist moral stance, right? In that he, taken at face value, he cannot apply anything different to himself than he would to others, and so it's just as bad for him to kill and worse because he can kill so easily. And so yeah, it's if Superman is who he is, then he could easily kill Bruce with one blow without even thinking about it, and then tattoo his name in laser writing on his chest. But instead, he tries to use the circumstance of the fight to reason with him between blows.
So there's a series of blows that kind of follow a chronological, like a planned out a pattern for Bruce, and it begins with at a distance with a series of missiles that sort of distract him, followed by a close range shot from here we see the Bat tank yet again, but one of the I find it just absolutely comical, right? Like, I'm not afraid to laugh amidst the action here, is Superman then proceeds to just freak open the tank like it's tinfoil, and here's Robin with
the slingshot.
The absurdity of it.
Yeah.
And his response, isn't tonight a school night? Like, he's just always thinking about that kind of thing in all of this.
You're still going to have to explain to us the whole thing about the slingshot. It seems so archaic that I think it must be a throwback somehow to the original Robin, but I don't recall ever seeing a slingshot before. And it's so clearly, even not against Superman, against other villains that she saw before, it's so clearly ineffective as a weapon. So it's a way for her to demonstrate her extreme loyalty to Batman without really getting her hands dirty with any potential killing force. It turns out to be an effective distractor, maybe, and so it's used that way.
Well, and I think that the ultimate history of the Boy Wonder is that this is just colorful distraction, right? Always talk about the difference in Batman and Robin. And Robin is in this colorful wardrobe to distract the villains, so that Batman can sneak up behind them, punch him in the face from behind or whatever is needed there. But yeah, this feature, I can only imagine how many Golden Age comics had at the back some kind of mail-in, advert for a pea shooter type of slingshot, right? Which was every boy's,
a Boy Wonder potato gun.
It was every boy's wonder in the 1950s in America. I mean, I grew up hearing stories about this essentially being their sidearm of children in that decade, and how much mischief they got into with it.
Another fruitful way to think about this, not for this podcast, but certainly one that maybe your listeners will be more familiar with. Look what Teen Titans did with Robin to move that character into something that would be palatable for the modern reader.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think even if you go back and look at those earliest Teen Titans or Titans comics, they were even the sort of artistic design of their costumes, their decor. I mean, it was very trying to think of pseudo punk, pseudo street style look.
Put it this way, it somehow made Robin's costume cool. I would have thought that's impossible.
Well, so Bruce can't even hear Superman talking, but he can tell he's talking because he's always talking, and because he's got he's got protection because he's about to let off a sonic gun, right? And he's trying to kind of distract him. He takes a single punch right to the gut, and his ribs are moving around after this point. I mean, he probably barely got him, but all this was a distraction so that Oliver could pop in unbeknownst to Clark and tag him with a single arrow, which Clark catches, but it doesn't stop it from releasing, because in fact it is a kryptonite arrow, right?
Which is green.
Yeah, it's using semiotics, those base colors of comic book storytelling, to tell us that Bruce has prepared for this moment. He talks about all those years spent a fortune knowing chemicals, right, and this sort of thing. So he's devised a kind of napalm, a kryptonite napalm, in that is released on Superman, and thus allows him to get a few more shots in. So he's kicking his face in. At this point, this is just this fan service, right? Of Batman waylaying into Superman like this. Those Golden Age kids never thought they'd see the day. He's putting his foot to a bloody chin here when we see that infamous heartbeat again, right? Followed by a kind of stable line, right? He, as Bruce, is having a heart attack mid fight, and it appears to be fatal. He falls to the ground, as cradled by Superman, nonetheless. And
again,
then
a very, very sophisticated narrative technique. We were teased by this earlier, right? When the EMP pulse knocked all the power out, Bruce was on the table, and his heart monitor stopped. And so Robin thought he was dead, but then Alfred says, no, he's very much alive. So we get, it's an echo, right? It's a foreshadowing. This is an echo of what we saw earlier, only now it really does stop.
And not only does it stop, unfortunately, across panel, we cut over to a different area. It appears this heartbreak is kismet, right? That Alfred senses it, and he casts his final breath after potentially burning down Wayne Manor and sort of liquidating the last of the resources and assets of. He's burning down.
Again, is no going back. There's no Alfred, and there's no Wayne Manor. So suddenly we're at a place at this page where you can't retrieve that narrative anymore. That it can't be okay between Superman and Batman. Batman can't go back to Wayne Manor. There has to be something different. So that helps us believe that Batman's really dead as well.
This was something the book was talking to us about all along, right? Though, is this idea of, Batman is stuck between not being able to retire, but his presence also creates problems for the city and within the city, as much as it helps resolve issues that perhaps the police can't fully account for. And it's an endless tension. And so it can only end one way, in death. And at the same time, though, there's something interesting here about what he's doing for Clark, for Superman, arguably. And an interpretation I have here is that he's, by Superman ending Batman, he's freeing Superman in a way that by taking him down in a very public way, which he was trying to do, he was attempting to redeem Superman from his endless public service that he was sort of, whether it was his own free will or out of obligation, right? At some point, they probably had him sign a contract, right, which he would feel guilty about if he broke. But I always got the sense as a reader, it's open to interpretation, that there is a bit of a salvation for Clark in this encounter too. And certainly there's a hint of that. There's a hint of this because we cut to the funeral scene, And not only that, we see our final newsreels noting that it's now public knowledge who Batman was, that he's dead, right? And so the veil has been lifted on this mythology, and this group is at the gravesite. Selina losing it; she's all catty still. Jim Gordon's holding her back, and Bruce. I'm sorry, Clark Kent is there as well in his human, disguise. And there's though a mention by the news that the Wayne fortune has disappeared, has been sold off, and they can't quite track the money trail. And at this time, as you can see this unfolding in a very cinematic fashion, as the group disperses, the last remaining figure is there. I assume Carrie, the new Robin, perhaps his distant cousin. Also not clear, but I might assume. There is the return, the blip, right, of
Single
Bruce's
heartbeat,
right?
Only Superman can hear it.
Only Superman, in his vast superpowers, can hear it. And he looks at Carrie. They look at each other. He hears it again. And we see a wink, a single wink, and he leaves. So he's going to leave him be. He's going to let the dead rest in peace. But then we have, as the book starts, once again, that internal monologue calling us underground, where we see the vast caverns, right? Perhaps beneath the former Batcave or elsewhere. And we have a new mission and perhaps a new man. We have the return of Bruce.
Perhaps a new world. This, it seems like the mission now is to recreate society in a way that's more just to begin with.
Well, that's pretty interesting because it's very much in line with that theme that I love talking about, this future shock version of an alt reality where things have gone cataclysmically wrong, and what do you do once you get to that point? And this suggests that Bruce has found a new mission, an adjacent mission to his previous one, but he's most importantly regained hope. He's regained the trust of others, and so he has with them down in this cavernous abyss, a permanent abyss, as they plan to move further inward, which is very telling of the hero's journey, or the tragic anti-hero. But he has Carrie there with him, the good soldier, right? The future, that representative of the future. And but they also have the reformed sons of Batman, who will don the mask, right? This is so it's no longer his lone mission, that he's building community in an effort to carve out a new tomorrow. All right, let's put a pin in it there. We've gone quite a while here, and what we're going to do, this is the end of this story, but it's not the end of Batman stories. It's certainly not the end of comics and comics history, and it's not even this comes out before the real cinematic birth of Batman even begins, right? We're discounting the 1966 TV movie Batman. And so what we'll do in this next episode is we'll talk about the legacy of The Dark Knight Returns. And we're going to look at ways in which this book influenced the direction of the character, direction of the books, these cinematic futures of Batman. I do say plural futures, and really the legacy of this book on the broader scope of comics. I think it's going to be very exciting, and I look forward to hashing it out, discussing it, having you back, Scott. We'll talk about it. Bring your questions. We'll see if others have questions as well. If that's the case, we'll love to bring them in. And so look forward to talking about that. We don't know which Batcave you might be representing that time.
This one is from the first Dark Knight movie with Christian Bale, who I know you and I both like as Batman. And we debated before the podcast. It's I'm not really sure if it's the actual Batcave or like the garage, but love the design, and you can see the design. This is a nice melding of believable future tech with that same idea of the dark cave, but in this case, it's made completely sterile and geometric. So the Batcave, just like Batman, is continually recreated by new writers and even new generations. This is whenever you have a character that survives this many decades, it's really important to pay attention because it's something that nearly everyone has access to at some level.
You know that Christopher Nolan's Bat films were famously designed by cinematographer Wally Pfister, right? Who is a frequent collaborator, and certainly a great look there. We've looked at some comic based backdrops, as well as we had our Tim Burton Batman 1989 Vista last time, and so we'll continue to experiment with that, and as it creates its own little meta commentary talking about Batman for our special topics in media podcast lecture series emphasis on Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns, as well as our broader topic, mythic media in America. Thank you for listening.
Special Topics in Media is a production in cooperation with Mid-America Christian University. Special Topics is produced by Garrett Castleberry, Executive Advisor Scott McMurray, Audio Engineer Will McMurray, Graphic Design Logo by Corey Fuller, Music composed by Austin Foster. Special Topics is produced in coordination with the Communication, Media, and Ethics program at Mid-America Christian University.